Morning, everyone. So good to see you. Yes, I survived my yesterday bike ride. It was hot, but that's summer. Do that a lot in the summer. Um, some thoughts. Those of you who saw the thumbnail of the Max Lucado book on fearlessness that I pulled out of my shelf this morning. I was thinking, actually, is kind of bugging me all day since we did yesterday's morning prayer. I talked at one point. I know I talked about the fact that yesterday I was talking about the fact that what we're dealing with is the race God is giving us to run, and we have to run it. It's the only race we have. And I talked about the things that hold us back, and I didn't re-listen to it, but I know that I had mentioned fear. I think in the context of sin. I'm not sure. I should have listened to it again, but I didn't have the time. But that's been bugging me a little bit, and I wanted to come back and visit that and talk a little bit about fear this morning and dealing with fear. Good morning, Sherry. Good morning, everybody. I'm not sure who all I missed. Pat, Marianne, Ann, Estella. Good morning, all. Linda, Mom, and maybe one or two other people listening. I'm not sure that's it. But anyway, wanted to go back and revisit and talk about fear this morning. And because I was a little uncomfortable with how I left that yesterday. Fear, fear's a really good thing in some ways. Fear's a God-given response. And it's really just a fabulous response that our body has. And fear serves a very good purpose in our lives. Fear is that kind of automatic response our body has to, gotta watch that glare in the back. Fear is the automatic response our body has to the potential for danger. And those of you who, I don't know if you ever had biology or chemistry classes and learned about our human fear response, and it really is just a kind of remarkable, complex thing that our body does. And, those of you who, if you ever thought about it, you hear a loud noise, a thunderclap, for example, or a door slam in your house, and how your body, faster than a blink, it's milliseconds that your body responds and chemicals get released through your body. And it's just a really remarkable process that our body goes through, this fear response, leading to what we all know is the fight or flight syndrome, the fight or flight response, where, your body is prepared instantly to either flee or to resist whatever it is that is going on. So this fear response is remarkable. It's a God-given thing to us, God-given design in our bodies. So it's a good thing. I mean, fear is a good thing. Just the fact that we sometimes are afraid is certainly not sinful at all. And I guess I wanted to clarify that from what we talked about yesterday. But here's the problem, and here's what happens. And this is what's happening. Actually, there's a couple things that are happening in our world when it comes to fear. When fear kind of settles, when it becomes constant, what it becomes in us is that anxiety that so many people are dealing with. It's almost epidemic, and there's so much anxiety. And honestly, in the climate that we are in right now, anxiety is really, really hurting a lot of people, and it's crippling a lot of people. People that I love, and that's, I don't mean this in any way. This is not meant to be judgmental in any way for those people struggling with anxiety. It's just a recognition. Good morning, Patrice. This recognition that what anxiety is fear that has settled, and it's constant. And the fear response in human beings is meant to alert us to danger and prepare us to deal with it. But ideally, once we've dealt with it, the fear goes away. And all of the hormones and everything else that's going on in our body that diminishes and gets flushed out of our bloodstream. But what happens when fear is constant is that never goes away. And that's what a lot of people are really struggling with right now. That sense of fear that is constant. And we're obviously as a world, we're really dealing with something that's real. It's not imaginary. It's very real. But one of the things that I do think we have to know and be honest about is the fact that fear sells. There's a market for fear. And that's one of the things that we're dealing with. And if I ask the question, is our world more dangerous now? Most of us would be inclined to say, yes, it is, because of the market for fear. So, for example, there's a guy named Frank Furedi who I think he's actually an English journalist. He started to realize that there is this market for fear. I'm not even actually sure if he's a journalist, but I believe he is. Gotta get some tea, sorry. But he started to recognize this market for fear, this sense that people were becoming increasingly aware that the perception is that the world is more dangerous. And people have that perception because of what we're constantly being fed. So here's one of the things he did. This Frank Furedi, if you want to look his name up, Furedi. He started tracking in English newspapers. This is not in America and not in the US, but he started tracking English newspapers. And in 1994, they used the phrase "at risk" a total of 2,037 times. So in 1994, in an English newspaper, they used the phrase "at risk" 2,037 times. In 1995, in just 1 year, the use of that phrase had doubled. That's a 100% increase. In 1996, another year later, it had increased by 50%, by half again. By the year 2000, that's just 6 years. In 6 years' times in English newspapers, that phrase "at risk" was used 18,000 times. That's something, I forget, like a 900% increase, something like that, in just 6 years' times. And he started tracking this idea that there's a market for fear, and fear sells. It makes people buy newspapers. It makes people turn on to the news. It's one reason why I know this gets me in trouble, but it's one reason that I don't watch the news. There's plenty of ways for me to figure out what's going on in the world. I do not need, personally, it's just not good for my soul to be fed fear. And that's what we're being fed. We, jokingly, and I say this kind of, many of you are aware, you've heard about the murder hornets. Do you remember when the murder hornets were big news? And after the murder hornets, there was a story about the dust storm from Africa, I guess it was, that was, going to, yeah, exactly. It's so true. And I'm sure I'm going to get there, Stephen, the fact that the world's becoming safer rather than more dangerous. But we don't think that. We're actually being told the reverse, that it's becoming more dangerous. So we had the murder hornets, we had the dust storm, and then right after that, we read about the pigs in China, where there's another new virus being discovered with the potential for a pandemic. And there's this constant drumbeat of fear. It's no wonder anxiety is an epidemic in our world, because this is what we're constantly being told. And I guess what I have recognized is people of a certain age, my age, I start to realize, I've heard all this before. Uh, this sounds like what I have heard in my past. I remember, and those of you who are, I don't know what age you would have to be, say maybe 50, 55 and above. I remember in my grade school classes, elementary school classes, maybe it might have been sixth grade. I remember watching a movie on climate change, but the message then was global cooling. And I distinctly remember watching this movie and learning that our world was going to perish because of global cooling. I will never, ever forget sitting there watching that movie because I'm a winter lover. Even then in sixth grade, I was. I will never forget thinking and being anxious and thinking, so I am going to get 4 or 5 good winters and then we're dead. That's what the message was back then. And that's not all that long ago. And that was the message of the movie that we watched, that the world was doomed because of global cooling. That's the way I processed it. I'm going to have 5 or 6 good winters, and then we're dead. I remember distinctly hearing about the killer bees from Africa that were invading. I remember seeing maps on the news. They were invading from the south, killer bees. And killer bees are a real thing. They exist. Well, I don't know if you call them fairly, it's safe to call them killer bees, but there's an aggressive bee from Africa. And decades ago, it was found in Mexico, and it was supposed to move north and spread through all of North America. And I remember thinking, I used to paint houses. And because of, painting houses, you're outside a lot. You're always dealing with wasp nests and bees nests. And I used to get stung quite a bit. And one summer, I think I may have even been married. If not, I was in college, maybe possibly still living at home. But I remember one summer getting stung quite a few times. My arm swelled up. I remember going to a doctor and the doctor saying, yeah, sometimes that venom accumulates and the body's reaction gets worse every time. He talked about the fact, obviously, that if you ever get stung and you start to have trouble breathing, get to emergency room right away. But I remember processing, oh my gosh, these killer bees are coming and I'm already having trouble with bee stings. I'm doomed if these killer bees show up. Going back even younger, for those of you who are roughly my age, maybe you remember the Cold War fear that we lived with. And that's not to say that threat didn't exist. It really existed. But there was a Cold War fear. And I remember going to Muhlenberg Elementary School. I remember the day when they walked us class by class to the bomb shelter that was in, I'm almost positive it was in Muhlenberg Elementary. I don't remember going anywhere else. But I remember going down to the bomb shelter and seeing the walls lined with cans, and there was a supply of water. And the reason for the visit was, worst comes to worst, we're going to herd you all down here, and there's going to be food for us, and there's going to be water. But as a kid, it was a terrifying thought that, I'm going to be marched down here away from my family, away from my parents and grandparents, and who knows how long it will be till we can get out of this bomb shelter. I remember doing the dive under your desk drills. Some of you will remember those. If there's if the siren goes off, everybody dives under their desk, and covers your head. I remember, my mom's listening, but I remember when I was a little kid, we had visited, we were living in Allentown, but we went to visit Pappy Daniker. Pappy Daniker was my dad's grandfather. He raised my dad in part after my dad's parents were murdered when my dad was a young man. And so I never knew my grandparents, but I knew Pappy Danaker, my great grandfather, a great guy. But I remember visiting Pappy Danaker, and it must have been at a time when the Cold War threat, for whatever reason, was something that was real and being talked about. And I was a little kid, and I overheard a conversation about the Russian planes. That's all I remember, the Russian planes. The fact that we can expect to see Russian planes. And I somehow, as a little kid, latched onto that and came home. And it happened to be during the time when the Allentown Fair was going on. And I had a bedroom facing Tillman Street. We lived on the corner of St. Lucas and Tillman. My bedroom faced Tillman Street. And I remember one night, shortly after this conversation, lying in bed, and for some reason, like a crack in the curtain or whatever it was, the lights of the Ferris wheel from the Allentown Fair, I kept seeing those red lights going in this circle. And I didn't realize it was the Ferris wheel. I interpreted it as, oh no, here come the planes. I just saw these red lights and I thought, here come the planes. And I remember lying in bed being absolutely terrified, just waiting and waiting for the explosion, for the bombs to go off. So all that to say, I hear this stuff, murder hornets, dust storms, a new pandemic. And in my mind, I think I've heard this before. I've been sold fear before. And so I kind of start to think, maybe I am being sold fear. And I think that's what's happening. Now, I know that some of you are going to say, that I'm being dismissive, and I'm not. What we're dealing with when we're dealing with this pandemic, it's a real thing. It's not imaginary. It exists. But I believe this to my core. The fear that we're being sold is doing more harm than good. The fear that we are being sold is doing more harm than good. I think about how Jesus dealt with fear, and I was just kind of cataloging some of the things that Jesus talked about when Jesus talked about fear. And let me read you just some scripture verses, some things that Jesus said. There's a conversation that Jesus had in John chapter 14. Great conversation. If you want to go read this when we're done. But this conversation is taking place on the very last night that Jesus is spending with his disciples prior to the cross. In fact, that whole episode, the prayer in Gethsemane, the arrest, all of that is just hours away from this conversation in John chapter 14. And Jesus says this, John chapter 14, verse 1, it actually opens with this comment. Jesus says, don't let your heart be troubled. Don't be afraid. Then I love this. He doesn't just say, don't be afraid, but he says, trust God. Trust me. Imagine that. Jesus, who knows that in a few hours they're going to see him hanging on a cross, what he's saying to them is, don't let your hearts be troubled. Don't be afraid. Trust God. Trust me. It's an incredible statement that Jesus is making. And then later in that same conversation in John chapter 14, he says this. Now imagine this. The night of the crucifixion, the night that's going to lead to the crucifixion, he says, I am leaving you with a gift. Peace. That's an astonishing thought that as Jesus is walking into this, knowing what's ahead for the disciples, he says, I'm leaving you a gift, peace. And then he says this, the peace that I give you, the world cannot give. Do not look to the world for the gift of peace. The world's going to sell you fear. And Jesus is saying, I am giving you peace, something that the world can't give. So do not let your hearts be troubled. I'm leaving you with a gift, the gift of peace. And the peace I give you, the world can't give you. So do not be afraid. Luke chapter 12. This is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the section where Jesus is talking to his disciples, to his followers, about worry and anxiety. And he says this in Luke 12. He says, what's the price of 5 sparrows? 2 cents. Yet God does not forget a single one of them. The very hairs on your head are numbered. So do not fear, for you are of more value than sparrows. And then in Luke chapter 12, I've got to, looking at the time, I'm talking for too long. Luke chapter 12, the episode where Jesus is, he walks on water through the storm, meets his disciples, and he says this, I love this, do not be afraid, take courage. I am here. And I love that statement of Jesus, that promise. Again, he doesn't just say, don't be afraid. He says, don't be afraid, take courage, for I am here. And then the last one, the last episode, or the last comment about fear from Jesus. This is in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 is an interesting section because Jesus is talking about some really difficult things that are going to happen to the world. And he says this, when reports come in of wars and rumors of wars, keep your head and don't panic. Matthew chapter 24, verse 26, if you want to look at it. And then he goes on to talk about that. But I love this. Jesus is talking about what we're going to hear, what we're going to be fed. And he says, when reports come in of wars and rumors of wars, keep your head and don't panic. So all that to say that, I'm pretty sure that some people will think I'm being dismissive, and I'm not. I'm simply saying that we're going to be fed 2 messages. And one is a message that comes from the world because fear sells. There's a market for it. And we will constantly be told that there's something to be afraid of. On the other hand, there's the message from Jesus. And the message from Jesus is, I'm here. I am here. Do not be afraid. I suppose we have a choice. Which of those messages are we going to believe? Where are we going to live our lives? Doesn't mean the anxiety is going to go away easily. I don't mean to dismiss it. People I love very much are really struggling with anxiety. And, 120, so I'm sorry it's so long, 124-minute thing isn't going to make that go away. But I really hope that we can be people who recognize, the message of Jesus. Jesus who loves our kids more than we love them, loves our grandkids more than we love them. Even for them, Jesus is saying, don't be afraid. I'm here. Take courage. I'm here. So let me pray, and then let's move on with our day. God, I pray for all of us really so many people right now who are struggling and who are anxious. And God, we're anxious because we know that this is a real thing. This isn't pretend. We're dealing with some real stuff. On the other hand, God, I know that for many people, fear is accumulating. We're constantly being told that there are things that we should be afraid of. Father, I want to pray for, especially for people who are struggling. I pray for parents who look at their kids and who are so anxious about them. I understand that, God. I think of my kids every moment of every day. And God, I'm so grateful that I can trust you to care for my kids more than I do. I know, God, that you love them deeply. Same for my grandkids, God. I know that as delighted as I am to look at my grandkids, I know that you're even more so. God, I pray for those of us who are anxious about finances, who are anxious about family and friends. I pray for those of us who know people who are sick. I pray for those of us who are anxious about the fact that we're married to doctors or nurses, people who have in their family policemen, first responders. So many of us, God, who have things that just cause us to be anxious every day. God, these are real things. They're not imaginary. But on the other hand, God, I pray that we would also come to believe that you're real, that you are not imaginary, that you're just as real as every threat that we face. I pray, God, that we'd be people of courage, just as you said to your disciples, God, that we can take courage because you are here. Pray, God, that we'd remember that every moment of our lives. Help us to be people, God, who, even though we struggle with anxiety and with fear, I pray, God, that you'll help us to be people who continually turn to you and say to you every moment that we're afraid, God, help me to remember that you're present, that you're here, and that I can be a man or a woman of courage. I pray, God, that you'll help us to be this way as we go through this day ahead of us. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty, everybody. Thank you very much. I hope you guys have a good day. Love you all. And see you. Not sure if it's Stephen or Tim tomorrow, but you'll meet one of them tomorrow, and then I'll see you Sunday. Goodbye.